Now, another person that is also quoted in something we're handing out outside is B.R. Ambedkar. B.R. Ambedkar, for those of you who don't know, was the person who coined the term Dalit, oppressed. And he was from that community himself, and he converted to become a Buddhist. He was considered the father of the Indian Constitution, or one of the authors, sort of like the figure of Thomas Jefferson, or one of those great thinkers, great intellectuals. And one of the excerpts I have in the handout outside that you can read gives an argument on why he thinks that the Dalits should not convert to Christianity or Islam. Regardless of what they're facing, he gives this very interesting argument that this will break up the unity of India. And his argument is that these religions are so institutionalized and so centrally managed, and the nexus, the headquarters of this management lies in a foreign country, that if a sizable number of Indians were to convert to these faiths, it would break up India, because these would be subservient to the needs of the headquarters, or they would be getting the directives from the Western headquarters. So while he had all these problems that Dalits today have, and he chose to convert, he argues, takes all the religious options and picks Buddhism because he says that it is the best option for an Indian to convert into who's feeling that there is discrimination, because the other two the options of Christianity and Islam would cause national harm, and he's quite strong about this. Now, the problems that the book talks about have to do with a whole phenomenon of people who convert to Christianity for whatever reason. Some may do it for actual faith, and others may do it because they got a better deal, and others may do it because they'll get into a management position, they'll get some money, they'll get some foreign trips, they'll become part of the worldwide Western establishment and be media prominent, so they'll be upgraded in their social status. Whatever the reason is, there is a gradual alienation from the native culture. There is a gradual distancing from the native, the indigenous culture. This is evident because you see in pockets where there's a sizable amount of conversion, that they begin to have their own cohesiveness, their own separateness of identity, and then this is fed by scholars and missionaries that your history is different, your ancestors were different, and you should change the language. So there's a whole de-Indianization as a part of the conversion process. This is something we are pointing out in the book. And there's a very vicious demonology of the majority religion of India. Very vicious in the sense that I have videotapes from, for instance, there's an organization called Gospel for Asia in Texas that is run by an Indian Christian, and in their literature they talk about sending $30 to $35 million a year to South India for their missions. And if you look at their videos, and I have a collection of them with me, the talk about Shiva is the devil, and these guys are evil, and these people are heathens. I mean, it is just real aggressive demagoguery, and you cannot deny it. In fact, some of this is available on YouTube. You can go up and look at it. And also the assault on Sanskrit is troublesome. Sanskrit is a language in which a lot of things have been written, mathematics and astronomy and health, a lot of things have been written, and of course religious discourse, but it's not only a religious kind of language. So it's sort of like somebody having a problem with what Romans might have done, or what some ancient or early Christian group might have done, and therefore demonize Latin or something like that, or just demonize the whole Latin and the whole classics tradition on the basis that you don't like some particular part of what's written in it. And so this business of demonizing Sanskrit as something evil and demonic that is also extremely tragic, and that is part of this project. Now, the results, while the church and non-church related secular foreign intervention have a right to engage in improving civil rights in India, the results which are not because of such forces, but because of the Indian government's own activities, are very impressive. And this also, we have some literature there. If you look at 50 years ago and today, the status of Dalits. How many were in parliament? How many were governors? How many were teachers? How many are policemen? How many are in certain, social situations of social status positions? You will find an enormous, upgrading, and it will be interesting to compare that with similar underprivileged people in other countries like Mexico or like Philippines or like Venezuela, which are all Christian. I mean, if you really think that Christianity is going to solve the problem, then by now it would have solved the problem in all these other third world countries, but it hasn't. And the progress that the underprivileged in India have made, it doesn't mean that more progress is not necessary. But the gap between the upper strata and the lower strata in certain statistics has improved over the last 50 years. The overall situation in education is bad for all strata because a large percent of Indians do not get primary education. But that is not caste biased or something like that. That is across the board. But the second factor that has improved the plight of people, which has nothing to do with church intervention, is entrepreneurship. I mean, there's a lot of Dalit billionaires. I was reading a list of these people who are actually now billionaires. There's a huge club of billionaires in India, and some of them are actually Dalits. So the entrepreneurial character of these people is such that without necessarily some big brother taking care of them and looking after them, they have been able to move themselves up on their own. The book is very critical of certain US-based, particularly, programs. Like there is a Joshua program out of Denver, which has identified the 10-degree and 40-degree latitude in which India is a big target, as the target to convert and come up with a massive amount of funding and allocated it to a lot of groups in India to sort of carry out this. Then there are people like World Vision. We have a section on World Vision and their role. I mean, in some other countries, I'm not making the claim for India, but in some other countries in Latin America, they claim links with CIA to try and actually be an arm of the government, of the US government, doing some undercover operations. Then this global, the Gospel for Asia I mentioned. Then Dalit Freedom Network. Now, an interesting thing is that when people mention Dalit Freedom Network, one would think that it's Dalits who initiated it and Dalits in charge of it. But when you really look behind who are the originators, it's people in the United States, non-Indian, non-Dalit, who are sometimes, many of them right-wing Christians, who organized a Dalit Freedom Network and put a bunch of Dalits in front as the face. So some of the Dalits have become very prominent and very popular as sort of leaders. But if you really look at the history and who's pulling the strings and who controls, and some of this data is available, those are not the Dalit people themselves. So those are, and then if you look at these right-wing Christians' own background in their own country, in their own backyard, their voting records, there are some Republican congressmen in it and people of that sort, you will find that it's a contradiction because their own record on race and gender is hardly liberating. And yet they are trying to free some people in the other end of the world. So there is a kind of something artificial, something not quite right about these things. And then there is the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. There's a chapter which critiques them also. And this was set up with right-wing pressure. It was signed into law by Bill Clinton when he was president. And it holds hearings on atrocities which have to do with lack of religious freedom. Now, we've analyzed in this book every year's report as it pertains to India, and it's amazing that the Hindus are always the culprits, and somebody else, generally Christians, are sort of the victims. And a person reading would think that this is a one-sided situation with a huge amount of persecution going on, but that is literally not the case. And we pointed out some blatant errors they've made, and the kind of witnesses they've relied upon, who the courts of India have dismissed, and some of the testimony that they've given has been proven false. So there's a big pipeline from the collection of such things in India and all the way to places like Washington and Brussels and London and various media outlets and how to kind of really rabble-rouse an image that there's some horrible things going on. And the US Commission has in some years listed India on the same level of lack of religious freedom as North Korea, Saudi Arabia. They've listed India in that category as a country. Now, people who live in India laugh at this because they think it's the last thing you would accuse Indian society is lack of religious freedom, because the freedom to pursue your own religion is one of the very deeply rooted things. But there is this huge propaganda machinery, and we also have a chapter on the Christian media, which is there are global networks, media networks, and then they meet. They have annual meetings here and there, and they champion people in various countries to supply news that will feed this kind of mentality, this kind of victimhood, martyrdom, victimhood, this sort of mentality, and they give awards. They recognize the people in India who feed this sort of stuff, atrocity literature, we call it. So there's a chapter which talks about how that machinery works, who are some of the major players in it, and so on. Now, the challenges that I'm raising for people who are interested in where are we going with this. I'm raising a few challenges. First, the challenge I'm raising is we need to question who's a minority in India. If a minority group becomes more or less a subsidiary of a foreign enterprise, then it's not a minority. It's a foreign branch office. And the analogy I give is that if you see a McDonald's restaurant somewhere in India and there's only 20 employees, you're not going to say this is a minority establishment because it's small scale business, 20 employees. You know that it's the branch office of a mighty multinational. If you see a small Coca-Cola retail shop, that Coca-Cola operation is not a minority. It's part of a global Coca-Cola brand. So it should be the same criteria. If supposedly there was a minority and there has been a minority, but they are now governed by, the criteria is whether they're governed by a nexus overseas, whether their funding comes from a headquarters overseas, whether their ideology, whether their management and leadership training comes from overseas, whether they look up to some boss overseas for recognition because he makes them famous, whether this overseas headquarters gives them the legitimacy, the politics, the media coverage, the public relations. If all these are true, or if several of them are true, then under corporate law, this would be considered a controlled foreign corporation. If the same thing happened to a private company, it would be considered a subsidiary or a branch office of a foreign enterprise. So if you apply the same criteria, some of the outfits in India should not be qualified as minorities. So this is a challenge that I'm posing. I'm not saying all of them are like that. I know there are many very good ones, very legitimate ones, that are doing excellent work, that are very autonomous, that are not getting their marching orders from somewhere else, that are following their own conscience and their own idea of the faith, and not subservient to a foreign master. But then our book is talking about the ones which are actually doing this.